So apologies beforehand if I make big steps in the ethical discussion. And I think Ana Vega's lecture was a great introduction for the ethical debate. She already told that the two Chinese papers from April 2015, actually they ignited the ethical debate. But of course, the history and also the ethical discussion on germline modification already started in the 1970s. So it's not a completely new debate, and I think one of my messages is that we can learn a lot from discussions earlier on in the 70s and also in the 80s. So please do not reinvent the wheel on this. So I think there are two developments particularly important. First of all, in the 1970s, the emergence of recombinant DNA technology and the associated discussion. And secondly, of course, the emergence of reproductive technologies. And so in 1978, she's almost as old as I am, there was Louisa Brown, so the first person born out of in vitro fertilization. And also from an ethical perspective, it's interesting to see how newspapers wrote about the birth of Louise. It was some were about, it's a super babe, so they were amazed and fascinated, but some were also angry and annoyed, and they had fear about this new technology. And you can see analogies with how people right now can react to germline gene editing. So if you take these two together, genetic technology, recombinant DNA, and reproductive medicine, you get reproductive genetic technologies. And I usually show a picture of a very early embryo, also to remind people that it's not particularly germline editing, it's not about fetuses, but it's in a very early stage of development, as you can see in here. So at the crossroads there are many ethical discussions. This is a copy of my PhD thesis, which I wrote in Maastricht universities about the ethical issues, and this was 9 years ago, but actually many of the questions are still here on the agenda. So what you can see, if you go back to the 70s, we had an international debate about genetic testing, about genetic selection, about screening programs, and I think you can say there is now some consensus that although there are ethical discussions, it is acceptable to offer those techniques in national programs. But there has been made one exception, which is for germline modification, which I define here as a modification that is passed on to the child's children, etc., etc. So it's very interesting to see that this application has been what many call the line in the sand. So read the papers. Many are talking about this is the ethical line we should not cross. And you can also see this in legislation. So this is the Oviedo Convention, which is an important ethical guideline from the Council of Europe. Article 13 says that an intervention seeking to modify the human genome may only be undertaken for preventive, diagnostic or therapeutic purposes, and only if its aim is not to introduce any modification in the genome of any descendants. So it's a very explicit prohibition. And another example is from my own country, the Netherlands, but I know it's in many other EU countries, but also worldwide. Also here we have our embryo law, and there is, in Dutch, so you cannot read it, but trust me, it says actually the same as in the Council of Europe. So do not modify the germline. So actually, if we would like to advance this technique into embryos and gametes, then we also have to advance a huge ethical but also legal step, and it will imply regulatory change in many countries. And of course the immediate cause for this discussion is the publications, proof of concept publications about using CRISPR-Cas in human embryos, first for disease prevention purposes, then also for studying embryonic development. The children are not able to give consent I think that's quite a strange argument because neither of us gave consent for being one. And too risky. I think that's a fair argument. But all arguments, some are more valuable, I think, some are less valuable, but at least you can replace germline genome editing with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or with another reproductive genetic technology, and then the reasoning is exactly the same. So I'm not sure where the specific points are. It's a quite generic ethical discussion. And that's also for the reasons for advancing this technique, that it's a part of reproductive autonomy, so that people should be free to decide how to have children, or to prevent human suffering, prevent serious disease, etc. So very valid arguments, but not specific for genome editing. So the next question then is, what is new? Are there some specifics? And in that case, I think it might be useful to compare this with another reproductive technique, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, also known as embryo selection. Because Anna Vega already said, well, is there any use for germline genome editing if we have embryo selection? Well, I might think there could be, because with embryo selection there's only a limited amount of embryos, so you're actually stuck or bound to the embryos, but also the genetic material of the providers of the gametes. So that's all there is. And the affected embryos are discarded. It's not a very even if you don't think embryos have high value, then still it's not a very elegant option, just to throw them away. Well, with embryo modification, you can simultaneously modify several variants. So some people would say that's a slippery slope, because then you can also change non-disease genes. But others would say it's very efficient and you can do much more than only preventing one disease gene. For example, adding resistance to HIV or malaria. Is that enhancement? What about other vaccination programs? So I think that is worthwhile having a discussion about. Well, it's more risky, yes it is, because it's invasive rather than selective. But you could also say it's more in line with the goals of medicine, because it's a very early form of gene therapy in the human embryo, rather than selecting. So I think it might be interesting to expand or explore the differences a little bit. And then my third and last observation about last 1.5 years is about the governance of genome editing. And if we think about international governance of genetic technology, people usually refer to Asilomar, which was a huge conference in 1973, where scientists came together to discuss the emerging recombinant DNA technology. And some people call this the Woodstock of science, because it was famous and all scientists came together and they regulated the techniques themselves. But interesting, Asilomar has been criticized last years, and particularly right now it has been said that it wasn't the Woodstock, but it was very exclusive. So there were only basic scientists, there were only men. There were no social scientists, no patients, no ethicists, no policymakers, no politicians. And they were talking in the vocabulary of risk assessment and controlling risk. But gene editing and genetic technology is not only altering genes, but it's also altering society and how we view disease and human reproduction. So I think a fair part of critique is that if you organize the ethics of genome editing, it should be very inclusive and many people should be involved, particularly also patient organizations. So I think it's great you're interested in this topic. So what was a good thing in the Washington DC consensus statement, after 3 days there was a consensus statement, and actually it said there is a need for an ongoing forum. And it also said that the forum should be inclusive among nations and engage with a wide range of perspectives and expertise, including all the stakeholders I just mentioned.
Well, this has been an interesting journey for me because I moved to the UK in 2004 to do a PhD on, I hope, would be on human cloning. And my supervisors, one from the law school and one from the Science and Technology Studies, they both laughed at me and they said that, no, that's not happening. But well, I finished my PhD in 2009, and in 7 years, mitochondrial replacement techniques were regulated in the UK, and we are hearing about gene editing. So cloning maybe was not going to happen ever, but more interesting things are happening. In the meanwhile, I just studied nanoconception, by the way, unfortunately. But so the news about my talk is, I'm very worried about the fact that, which Anil just mentioned, that whether regulations matter. Because while we were giving so much consideration and thoughts about mitochondrial replacement techniques in the UK, doctors went and crossed the borders and created the first child using these new techniques. So regulations, do they matter? I don't know, but I think that if we can adopt a good model to follow, most scientists would like to work under good ethical and regulative guidelines. So at least we can maybe think about creating an ideal model that everyone can follow easily. So this talk will be mostly about the international legislation that will involve declarations, conventions, reports, and statements, and I will try not to bore you. There will be a talk about human rights concerns that we can think about. I will talk about a case study of the UK, UK's regulations of mitochondrial replacement techniques, not in detail, but just to talk about what the potential model could be for regulation in the future. And we'll touch on some of the academical debates on how to regulate. So this lengthy list, which I'm not going to read you through, is just a very small part of what is available out there in the international framework. So we have done a little mapping study, and there are pages of documents actually, which is relevant, directly or indirectly relevant to potential applications of genome editing. But most of the conventions, declarations, and reports focus on one thing. It's very, very important: the safety of the future generations. So I'm going to talk about emerging themes, important themes from these documents, and then we'll talk about the UK case a little bit. So, safety for the next generation. This is a declaration of Inuyama in 1990, and they did not foresee this. That they are talking about genetic testing or treatment not yet in prospect, but if it happens, there should be limits placed on DNA alterations in human germ cells, because such changes would affect future generations whose consent cannot be obtained, as Anilin mentioned earlier, and whose best interests would be difficult to calculate. So you will notice that there is an emphasis on germline interventions here, because more or less there is a consensus of somatic cell applications, if they are proved to be safe, are not that much controversial. But germline interventions are seen as very, very risky area. So here again, another statement: before germline therapy is undertaken, its safety must be very well established. For changes in germ cells would affect the descendants of patients. So it's a concern about future generations. So this is Convention on Human Rights of Biomedicine, 1997, OVEDA Convention, as I guess most of you are familiar with. And there's one thing coming out from this declaration, the convention, that the germline must not be edited to protect human dignity. So what human dignity is another issue. It's a controversial issue in ethics itself. What makes us different than, for example, non-humans. But it is in the core of this convention. So dignity and identity of the humans should be protected, and the interest and welfare of the human being shall prevail over the sole interest of society or science. This is to say that if you're a patient who is worried about, for example, their future children's health, should it, for example, prevail over the sole interest of society or science, for example, changing the germline of the next generations. And actually the convention warns us against potential discrimination against a person because of their genetic makeup or identity. So any intervention seeking to modify the human genome may only be undertaken for preventive or therapeutic purposes. Now this is Universal Declaration of the Human Genome, again in 1997, in the 1990s. So this Article 1 is very relevant and important, which describes the human genome as a heritage of humanity. So we all have the interest, we all have something at stake, all of us sitting in this room and the people outside, because it's our common heritage. So again, this underlines that germline intervention could be contrary to human dignity because it would involve damaging this human heritage. And this is the EU's Directive 2001, which also underlines the protection of germline identity, although I must say that somatic cell lines are not considered as such. So this is, again, to protect the germline identity, there should be no modification. However, editing of somatic cells is allowed as long as there is a written authorization. Another theme emerging from these conventions, statements, reports, documents in the international arena is discrimination. Of course, when you start changing the germline or editing the genetic makeup of children, the offspring or the next generations, there will be less people with certain characteristics. So it will reduce the diversity in the society, and people who already have certain conditions, traits, or disabilities will find less social support because there will be fewer of them. So that worry is also coming through in these documents. This is Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, again by UNESCO in 2005, which considers a more holistic approach because, as far as I could see, this is one of the few documents that germline editing could be relevant because it also talks about interconnection between human beings and other forms of life, which includes the plants and the cows and the rats and the mouse. We can actually change their genes, and due regard is to be given to the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life. Is coming through from this document. Now, there was a report of the International Bioethics Committee in 2015, so this is a very, very recent document, but it actually also refers to the 2005 UNESCO's convention. So it recommends a moratorium on genome editing of the human germline due to the safety issues, as well as the ethical issues. And there's also another thing that this heritage of humanity, which comes across in the UNESCO document, also again being cited here, that this is a heritage of humanity. What it means is, for us, I think, there's a real need for interdisciplinary and also all kinds of dialogue between the patient groups and people who are affected by genetic disease, people who are not affected by genetic disease. But we need a really, really inclusive debate because this is about all of us. It's not just for a certain group. And I think in that way, this report is spot on that it talks about that, we should really talk openly about this. There's also a list of things that we should consider, but I mean, just to mention a few: human dignity, social responsibility for health, sharing of benefits, protection of future generations, the environment, the biosphere and biodiversity, again that holistic understanding of the planet as humans and non-humans, and agriculture as well. So recently, European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies produced a statement, and they mentioned that the debate is occurring because of the mitochondrial replacement techniques, as well as the rise of CRISPR-Cas9, and we need to talk about this. So germline modification is deemed more ethically controversial than editing of somatic cells, because of its impact of, again, for the future generations. And the group felt that there must be a public debate on the issue due to the ethical, scientific, and regulatory issues which human gene editing involves. If you look at the human rights documents, we will also again see the human dignity being unavoidable and the prohibition of eugenic practices, discriminating people on the basis of their genetic traits, as well as exclusion of them by changing their genetic modification or genetic makeup, and any prohibition of discrimination on any ground, including genetic features and disability. European Convention on Human Rights also prohibits discrimination on these grounds. So what is the emerging themes then in the international legislation? It's the emphasis on human dignity. We all have a very, very dark history of eugenics. So there is a feeling of that they don't want this being experienced again. Eugenics is also related to discrimination, disability, and the lack of diversity. There are talks about genetic identity. Now this is another matter. What makes us human is not our genes. So that comes across in some of the documents, that genetic identity is not how we are made up genetically, but our education, our social status, our experiences. So that's one of another issues coming across, that genetic determinism is a dangerous thing that we should be careful about. There's a talk of consent of the future generations, and that's actually a term, for example, coined by Feinberg in 1983, the child's right to have a future. But you can also say that that involves not having a disability or a genetic problem in the future. So the consent issue is not really tackled in the documents, but there's a talk of it. Changing the germline is seen as something really dangerous, and the worry about future generations and their safety come across. There's a talk of human rights. Human genome as a heritage is another theme coming through. The autonomy of the people and the responsibility for the environment and the planet we are living in. So, let's move to the human genome editing in the UK. So the UK is the first country to allow germline modification. This has been discussed in length during the public debate. So that's how the regulations actually passed. That was the discourse. So this is not going to be exactly the same in gene editing. So this model cannot be exactly applicable. What is interesting is it actually opened the doors. And also, UK will be, I think, under the spot because it will work on licensing systems. So if the scientists want to work on mitochondrial replacement techniques, they have to first get a license from the HFEA. So it will be closely monitored. So it might actually give the other countries the feeling that this is all right, it's not just going out of bay, it's not a slippery slope, it's good regulation, it's going to be monitored carefully. But it might also tell other countries that this is fine, playing with the germline is fine. So we will just see who's going to adopt this regulation. But again, there will be countries who won't be regulating this area at all. And that will mean that some scientists can actually move to those jurisdictions where they can work more freely. So we shall see. But in the UK, somatics are part of anything relates to gene editing. It's covered by the Human Tissue Act 2008, whereas the other part of genome editing and anything considers the embryos and germline is governed by Human Fertilization and Embryology Act 1990. So the Secretary of State at any point may, in the developments of science of medicine, they may change the definition of embryo, eggs, and sperm, which is permitted for research, or sometimes for clinical practice. So these permitted eggs, permitted sperm, and permitted embryos is actually opening the doors to some kind of debate, doesn't it? So, and by the allowance of mitochondrial replacement techniques actually open the door for editing the specific circumstances of embryos because of this permitted embryo, permitted egg, and permitted sperm. But we shall see. This is the mitochondrial donation regulations, which passed last year in November, and it allows editing of the germline in a way under specific circumstances, as long as it doesn't affect the nucleus but just the mitochondria. What is interesting is there is now a license for human genome editing for research purposes. It was the Francis Crick Institute who got the first license, and that was for developing treatments for serious disease, increasing knowledge about the development of embryos, promoting advances in the treatment of infertility. But this is only going to be conducted, the research is only going to be conducted under the pre-embryo state, which is 14-day period. To wrap it up, I'll just talk about academic debate very briefly. The idea is, what's being said is, self-regulation by scientists is not appropriate. The society has a big stake at this, so we should get involved. And there should be wide variety of individuals, not only the academics, but also non-academics, scientists, patients, patient organizations, whoever thinks that this actually relates to us. And if it's our human heritage, we all have a stake in this. There is also a view that we must ensure a fair balance between the interests of those who support this research and those who don't, by listening to them. So there is also a discussion about the line between the therapeutic and non-therapeutic applications of this. And some say that we should support the basic research with regards to CRISPR-Cas9, and guidelines should be constantly updated, but we wait if it's going to be safely applicable in the clinical context. So overall, there's a need for a calm approach to regulation so as to prevent heavy-handed intervention. So some academics say that let's not think about a full blanket ban on these techniques, but take it slowly, just supporting basic research and see how it develops through the guidelines and careful, calm regulation. However, there is uncertainty, of course, as to how such a calm approach could be developed due to the various options on offer, which, when combined with ethical issues around the human genome editing, each have their own difficulties and benefits. And I think what is very important, the take-home message from all this is, we really need to get involved. We should all get our voices heard so that there will be a balanced debate about how to regulate. Thank you.